morning, everybody. I have to admit, because again, you can see me, I believe. I can't see you, so I feel like I'm a little bit at a disadvantage here. But I had to smile when Shane said Dr. Dan Chase. That still sounds funny, if not a little bit pretentious. But I laughed or I smiled because I still think of our now 5-year-old who's then 3 at the time when I first became Dr. Chase, and he was literally in tears, saying, "You're not a doctor, you're not a doctor," because in his mind, doctors give shots, right? That's what doctors do. But anyway, good morning, everybody. I'm excited to be with you today. I think we're going to talk about something that is, I hope is worth our time. Let me explain a couple of things first as we get started. The Balk, Stalk, or Talk is really kind of a silly title. I'm happy to acknowledge that. Last time I did this off the shelf series, it was Blink, Think, or Kitchen Sink. So I kind of just went with the same thing. But if you think about it, what we're talking about here is these challenging or difficult conversations that are really required of us as leaders, as managers to hold. And quite frankly, if we're going to go past professional realms, they are conversations that all of us should be having, right? Personally, professionally, otherwise. The balk is speaking to our hesitation to hold these conversations often. Sometimes we just don't. The stalk is sometimes we pursue it relentlessly, and maybe we shouldn't. Or is it just talk? Just have a conversation with people. The other thing I'm going to tell you is I don't think there's probably not a topic that I speak to more frequently. And what I mean by that is when there are requests for our team to present on things, it is almost always, well, how do you communicate with people? How do you communicate with employees that are underperforming, or you're having a difficult time with, or who have inappropriate behaviors, or you have a coworker that you don't get along with, or as we'll touch briefly on today, or when you have a boss that you don't get along with. So we're going to talk about, I think, something that is relevant, whether you're a supervisor now or in the future, something that is relevant to all of us. I'm also going to let you know that I've invited a few experts to participate in this conversation with us at particular times, supervisors, practicing supervisors right now that I've been in training with and worked with and seen how diligent and how talented they are as supervisors to share some thoughts. Now, really quickly, bear with me here before we jump into this important topic. We're trying to replicate live training as much as possible. It's just really hard to do. And normally, many of you who have registered for this class have had live training with me before. And you know that I'll spend actually a pretty decent amount of time on these questions that allow us to get to know each other. Quite a bit. If you could only listen to one band or musician for the rest of your life, who would you listen to? Or if you could only travel to one place, all expenses paid for a week, those kinds of things. Well, we can't do that right now. There's too many of you out there listening and participating right now. So I'm just going to share something. I don't know why I feel compelled to share this with you, but I feel I must confess something to you. For the past 2 days, and I hope you will not judge me. I hope I will not lose credibility with you as I expose myself and I'm vulnerable with you right now. For the past 2 days, as I've been working from home and doing other things as well as preparing for this webinar, I like to have music playing in my headphones, and I have been listening to the Milli Vanilli album. That's not a joke, by the way. That's not made up, but it does. I do feel like it's something I should own up to and admit to you. I love that album, that Milli Vanilli album. So now that I've established some vulnerability, I hope you won't throw it in my face. But by the way, I'm willing to bet that there are some closet Milli Vanilli fans out there that remember that from their youth. And if not, go check it out. Anyway, okay, box, stalk, or talk. So how do we have these challenging conversations? Well, here I want to make this very clear. You're going to see this slide a lot today. And the reason I show that GIF there is no matter how prepared you are, my experience with managers, with leaders, is that they still feel attacked, or they still feel overwhelmed by the responsibility of having these conversations. And that's why, look, this is me quoting myself today, right? But holding these challenging or difficult conversations, that is the price we pay when I say I'm going to be a leader, not just a manager, although that's included. But when I say, yeah, I'm going to be a leader for my team, for my agency, you accept that responsibility. And if you and I want to have credibility, We have to be the ones that are willing to hold these conversations, because there are certainly going to be issues on your teams and in your organizations that others are going to be aware of, even if they're just sensing it, and they're going to wonder, why isn't our boss? Why isn't Dan? Why isn't Joan? Why isn't Steve? Why isn't Julie? Why are they not? Why are they not addressing this? Why are they not talking to that person? Or even, why are they not talking to me about this? I know this bothers them. I assume this bothers them. Why aren't they? So, and if you and I are going to have credibility, we have to be willing to hold these conversations. And yet you and I know that they are very difficult to do, right? That's why we call them difficult conversations. And in fact, they are so difficult that very often in organizations, managers, people that aspire or wanting to be leaders, simply don't do it. So what we're going to talk about today are some ways to make us more comfortable, more confident in having these conversations. The first, we'll touch briefly on the role of trust in confident communications, how foundational that is to everything in organizational life, but in particular to communications. We'll talk about taking some of the stress out of these conversations and how we prepare for them more effectively. We'll look at the ways in which we, maybe unbeknownst to ourselves, are actually creating toxic dialogue, and how we can be aware of those things. And then finally, we'll spend not as much time as I'd like, but we'll spend a little bit of time on how do we manage up? How do we communicate more effectively? How do we manage our bosses on occasion? Okay. So by the way, when we're talking about difficult conversations, what do we mean? We're talking, look at this definition from kind of, I think, the first real substantive book to talk specifically and exclusively about having difficult conversations. The book is called Difficult Conversations, right? It came out before the Crucial series and all these other things, but look at this definition here and think of the implications. So if it's going to be a difficult conversation, maybe our ego's on the line, there's likely to be conflict or differing opinions, right? What we're talking about matters. It's important. What's at stake matters. Otherwise, if it was trivial, we probably wouldn't have the conversation in the first place. We care about what we're talking about, and we care about the people that we're having the conversation with. When those ingredients are there, well, then yeah, we're likely to have a challenging conversation. Now, I want to go back to thank you to all of you. We had a great response rate. We sent out some questions, right? What is it that prevents us from holding these difficult conversations? And if there's one thing you could change about the way you have these difficult or challenging conversations, what would it be? Well, now look, we had literally hundreds of responses, but if I were to summarize the majority, and there's some outliers, but if I were to summarize your responses, this is what they would be. The leading vote getter, so to speak, or the leading responses were a fear of emotions, both our own and the emotions we're going to elicit from others, as well as damaging the relationship. And maybe that's obvious, right? And similar to that is the fear of negative conflict. So we're going to talk about that today, because that's overwhelming to us. Is I've got to work with this person. I want a good relationship with them. And sometimes the thing that sours that relationship are those emotions. Interestingly enough, though, as you look down the list, right, this is kind of in the descending order of how often it was said, but fear of negative or fear of misspeaking. We're going to say something wrong, or how about this? We're going to make it worse. So here I am trying to address this issue, and because I am inarticulate, or because I'm not good at this, I'm going to make the dynamic worse and create more conflict, or I'm going to do something wrong, and HR is going to be jumping down my throat. Right? That very legitimate fears, right? I'm not unrelated to the other ones. I don't want to hurt other people's feelings. Not that I'm worried they're going to get angry. I don't want to be mean. I don't like making people feel bad. Fear of having to repeat conversations. Remember this one. We're going to talk about this specifically. You should not be having repeat conversations, right? The second you feel it's a repeat conversation, you need to change the conversation. It needs to be a different one altogether. Fear of being misunderstood. They're not going to get your intentions. I love this one too. Fear of being wrong in the first place. In other words, you feel like you're jumping down someone's throat and you're wrong, right? You got some bad information. Your perception was off. We'll talk about that. And then two that I also thought were interesting: fear of not being supported by management. They don't have your back. So you're going to do the right thing, hold a difficult conversation, and then your superiors come back and say, hey, you need to lay off. Oh man, talk about deflating, right? And then finally, of course, these can be really exhausting mentally, emotionally, as well as just time consuming. Okay. And what would you change? Again, overwhelmingly, we want to be more confident. The three leading vote getters, we want to be more confident. We don't want to be afraid of these conversations anymore. And look at the dichotomy here. We want to be more assertive, and we want to be less aggressive, or what you said. In other words, we have these people saying, yeah, I want to be out there, I want to say what I want to say more. And then other people saying, I need to scale back a bit because I feel like I'm too direct, I'm too blunt with people. So we'll talk about that balance, of course. You also said you want to learn how to course correct. In the middle, if things aren't going well, how do we fix it? How do we repair the conversation? How do we say what I really intended to say? We'll talk about that. How do we manage our own emotions? And I love this one, of course. How do we listen better? I'm not going to go through all of these. Similar to learn what I want to say, what I meant to say is communicate on our feet better. And then finally, we'll talk about these, what I call decoys. We'll call them thwarting tactics later. What about if someone, starts being manipulative in the conversation, or they change the subject, right? What do we do about that? Okay. Now I hope Gina is listening. I'd like to invite Gina really quickly, because this theme of emotions, our own and others, keeps coming up. And so Gina, if you'll jump off mute, can you share with us quickly what you think the role of emotions is and how you manage your own and others' emotions before you have effective conversations?
Yeah, hi, Dan. Thank you. So for me, the role of emotions plays both a positive and a negative role in how we manage these conversations. Obviously, when we're preparing for the conversation and we know that it has to happen, it causes a lot of anxiety in ourselves, as well as if you've planned it in advance, it can also bring a sense of confidence because you've taken the time to figure out exactly what you want to say so that you can mean what you meant to say, and say what you meant to say. I do also think for the staff member that you're working with or having the conversation with, there's always going to obviously be emotion. Half of our job as a leader is really managing those emotions, our own as well as theirs. I think the most important thing from my perspective in these conversations is really to kind of stop and take a step back and know that you do have the ability to, someone mentioned in one of these lists, course correct. You do have the ability to not have a conversation that always plays out exactly as you prepared it in your mind. I think sometimes we overthink and sometimes things go better than we actually anticipated. It's really important to know your audience and know that sometimes you might have to give them time to really chew on what you've said and then maybe come back and follow up with them and make sure that they understood what you wanted them to get out of the conversation.
Is it, Gina, if you can hear me, is it fair to say then, and by the way, Gina and I have not planned this, so I hope I'm not like, this doesn't end up really badly. Is it fair to, it seems to me then, the one thing I love about you said is the role of preparation. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, and we'll talk about that, how huge that is. And most of us, I don't know that we formally prepare. Now, look, we stew over it. Yeah. Right. We fret about it, but are we actually strategizing? I think that's critical. The other thing is it fair to say then that maybe it's okay if a difficult conversation becomes two conversations? In other words, so I have a conversation with someone, maybe if it's my employee needs time to think things over, that I have this difficult conversation with them, we address things, and then I say, let's talk again in 2 days and tell me what you think, or let's readdress this. Is that, in your mind, is that an acceptable plan?
Yeah, in fact, it's one that I use quite frequently for more reasons than one. Sometimes it will become a heated, feeling-wise situation, not necessarily argumentative, but you can just tell that they're overwhelmed by the information that you're giving. And so maybe you know that you need to give them time to process. And it is always good to come back to check for understanding, as well as to build that relationship of trust and let them know that you understand that it's not an easy situation and that you want to check in on them and make sure that they're doing okay and that there's not something more that they need from you.
I love it. I love it. And this idea too, and I'm glad you brought this up because I don't know that I'm going to address it enough. So let's say it as strongly as we can now. This idea of tailoring the dialogue to, I think you said, know your audience. Right. And that comes over time. It comes with experience. Sometimes it comes because we've had bad conversations. We learn, oh, let's not do that with this employee or this person that we're having the conversation with. So, Gina, thank you. That is,
Yeah, you're welcome.
anything else? I don't want to cut you off. Anything else, or are we good?
No, I think it, like you said, it's really important to just make sure that you know your audience. I have some folks that I know, if I put something on their calendar, they're going to stress about it for however long it's on there. So it's easier for me to just grab them when I'm ready to have the conversation. And then there's others that I know need that preparation time to get themselves emotionally grounded to have the conversation. And so I really do think you have to know your audience.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, Gina. Appreciate that. Thanks for those insights. Okay. So now remember the first thing we're going to talk about. Now I'm going to go, a lot of you again have had training with me before on this very topic. So I apologize if you're like, oh, there's that Dan spiel again. But it certainly bears repeating, right? It's worthy of our time here today. And that's the role of trust in confident communications. And it's one thing for you and I to talk about trust, but let's get down to what the science, the social science says on trust, right? First of all, I love this. Maybe the most in vogue book right now on having difficult conversations is Kim Scott's Radical Candor. And you see there from the quote that if you can build trust with people right now, that's going to impact everything else that follows. And that's true of communications too. So stay with me here as we talk about trust in three primary ways. And we say aim to build trust. Our acronym is AIM here. The first is, if I'm going to trust you, there's got to be some competence there. There's got to be some ability. I've got to think that you know what you're talking about. Now, think about this for a second when you're having a difficult conversation. Let's say you're having a difficult conversation about my behavior, and it has nothing to do with some sort of technical knowledge. Well, what does ability mean then? Well, what we could probably add is a cred in front of that ability. And partly then it goes to, do you have credibility with the people? You know, do you walk the talk? And that's related to integrity, but also, are you seen as professional? Do you see, are you seen as having even ability in terms of holding difficult conversations? Right. So it doesn't mean only that, well, you better be able to do the job of your employees as better than they can, and then they'll trust you. Now that's great, but sometimes as managers, we manage people that do specific tasks, specialized things that we don't specialize in ourselves. You can still have trust with them, right? So maybe we should say credibility along with ability. The second, not unrelated, is integrity. Do I see you as walking the talk, or living the values that you claim to have? Do I believe that you are about what you say that you are about? To the degree that you do, I will see you as having integrity, and I am willing to offer you my trust. And then thirdly, and for whatever reason, this one resonates the most with me, the idea is motivations. A lot of times in the literature, it's called benevolence, but here is, do I trust your motivations towards me, the reason you're having this difficult conversation, the reason you do anything? Do I trust it's because you care about what we're doing with our work? Do I trust that it's because you care about me? Now, most of you, here's the problem. Most of you will say, well, yeah, I got all those things, right? But that does not mean that your people sense that from you. So partly what we want to do is we want to gauge to the extent, including simply asking people and communicating that we want to be seen as trustworthy to them. Do you know what my intentions are? Let me state my intentions, my motivations to you. And then, of course, we're on the hook to have integrity and live those intentions, not just state them, right? But once we state our values, we got to follow through with that. So we want to aim to build trust here. What's the relationship between trust and communications? Well, look at this from Colquitt and Salam, did this massive study on trust. They say that leaders need to foster trust because it has all these positive impacts for organizational life: innovation, performance, commitment to decisions, commitment to the organization, improve work relationships, and then, of course, communications. The idea is now, there's just no question. Right now, let's say you are starting from scratch today. To the extent that you can create trust, it will reduce the stress and anxiety that you have for these communications. Real trust, right? Not just surface friendly, collegial relationships, but real substantive trust with the people that you work with and for and around. To the degree that trust, that AIM of trust is there, you will be more confident in having these conversations, and they will be more responsive to your difficult conversations because they'll know where you're coming from. You and I probably know people that it seems like they can be very direct with people in a degree that we would like to, and yet we're scared to. They're not. They seem to, quote unquote, get away with it. It's because there is trust there. Right. And the idea here is that you and I want to communicate in a way, we want to have these conversations, not so that we are just taking out of the trust bank, so to speak, but we are actually improving. If you and I can make it through a difficult episode or difficult conversations with people, and we do it in the right way, I genuinely believe that trust can actually go up. We've got some battle scars now together in a good way, where we've touched on something sensitive and we've survived. Maybe we're even thriving now. I suspect trust will even go up. And that's why you see this kind of recursive dynamic there. So that's a quick and dirty overview of something that's absolutely foundational. But you and I have to go out of our way to assess and ascertain what the trust level is. Now, a lot of times we'll just have a sense of it, but there's nothing that precludes you from speaking overtly about this with your teams and saying, you guys, what is our trust level? We need to improve this on our teams. And in fact, being that kind of direct then can even improve trust, right? So trust is absolutely foundational to being confident in these communications, having successful communications. Let me go now to reducing the stress of stressful conversations. Now, I want to go back to something that Gina said, and that is this idea of how critical preparation is. In fact, you guys, sometimes as I've talked with groups all across the country about communications, people, you and I are looking for magic phrases, right? That is like, oh, all of a sudden now, if you give a turn of phrase this way, everything's going to be golden. And quite frankly, turns of phrase matter, wording matters. We'll talk about that, but I cannot overstate to you how much preparation reduces the stress of these conversations and allows us the opportunity to be successful. Okay. Now, having said that, look at this quote here again. I'm quoting myself here because I'm unoriginal. If the other person does not respond well to a conversation, that is not necessarily an indication that you have done something wrong. We cannot control their emotions. We cannot control their responses. What we are trying to do here is give ourselves and them the best opportunity for healthy dialogue and a good relationship going forward. Okay. But the too often we have people that are set on giving a negative reaction, that we call them thwarting tactics. We'll talk about that here in a second. And so we say, I failed. Not necessarily. But you've got to start off here with the right mindset if you're going to have and it seems, and no matter the piece of literature that you look at, really what they're talking about is the same thing. So I've got 3 bullet points here, but what I want to tell you is really it's the same thing. So if you look at historically, the discussion on effective management has been the dynamic between task and relationship. And your job as an effective leader is to get people to do their task, to perform, right? To perform well, but also you want to maintain a healthy relationship because that's generally what keeps people committed to an organization. So it's not just doing this task or this project or doing it for 2 months. We want them doing their jobs well and being committed to the organization for 30 years. That's the ideal circumstance. Okay. Now, something that I've always said, I think if you're going to be an effective supervisor manager, your people need to be able to answer this question in the affirmative. Do they think that you care about the work that they do, and do you care about them personally? That's it. If they can answer that in the affirmative, you're in a position to lead. And then if you look at, I talked about Kim Scott and radical candor. She calls it challenging directly, but care personally. If you challenge people directly, you care about the work that they do and you hold them accountable, but you care for them personally, you can be radically candid, is what she said. We're all saying the same thing. All the literature on this. So that's that first mindset, okay, that we have to have. Okay, now something else. I'm taking from a lot of different sources here. This is the crucial series that we know, crucial conversations, crucial accountability. The first thing that you and I have to do, again, this is work to be done, mindset, mastering your stories, before we ever have the conversation. Now, we've got this path to action model, which is we see and we hear something, an employee not performing, an employee performing, behaving badly, a coworker that we think is dismissive of us or rude to us in meeting, whatever it is. We see or we hear something happens, and we tell ourselves a story. In other words, we impute motive to them. We say they are doing this because, and then we treat that as a fact. We say, well, in my mind, I know they're doing it because of this. That makes us feel a certain way, hurt, offended, bothered, angry, frustrated, whatever else it might be. And then we act. Too often we go into those conversations and either A, we fly off the handle, or we don't have the conversation, but we still act, usually passive aggressively. And it comes out and it damages the relationship. Now, Candace, if you're on, I know you've had a lot of experience and you have some strong feelings about the importance of mastering your stories before we jump into conversations. Are you willing to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Dan. I really found separating the fact from the story at the beginning, as well as even in my conversations, in these difficult conversations, has been one of the most powerful strategies to having them and feeling that confidence that people are looking for. I think it also helps to diffuse the situation and the defensive emotions, either on my side or the staff side or whoever it is, and as well as it creates a willingness to be wrong, right? Like, so one of the examples, simple example, is if you're walking down the hall and Susie doesn't smile at you or she doesn't say hi, and I personally like, oh, she must be really mad at me, right? The fact is Susie didn't say hi. The story is that she's mad at me. Like I created that feeling or that story surrounding her, that action, and then being able to go into that conversation and being able to separate that and say, Susie, I noticed you didn't say hi to me in the hall. The story I told myself was that you were mad at me. Am I wrong? Or it allows you to be wrong in your story, and then they can correct it. Or she could be like, well, actually I am, right? But it creates kind of this safe space for, the story to be wrong or right. And a couple other things I would just add to that is addressing conflict as soon as you possibly can. Considering the preparation and going through all of these things is critically important. So if you're like all fiery, it's not the time to have the conversation. Diffuse, calm down. But as soon as possible, have that story, separate the fact, or have that conversation, separate the facts from the story. And then the last thing I would add is just make sure you know what you're requesting. If you request a different action or something, and then having a clear agreement, and being willing to know that your request may not be 100% met because of something that they have going on, but getting to that place of clear agreement is really important as well in having these difficult conversations.
Yeah, and by the way, if anybody is named Susie, she's not talking about you.
Sorry, yeah.
By the way, now, Candace, one of the things that I really like about what you said is if I understood you correctly, even there are times where we tell ourselves a story, and guess what? Sometimes we're right, as you point out. Susie was mad. Is the real virtue of this then that we have calmed down, right? I love what you said about, at least at a minimum, checking our stories and making sure we're not treating them as facts kind of gets in our minds, opens up the possibility I could be totally wrong about this. And it seems like that's diffusing. Is that fair, what I just said?
Yes. Yeah. I think it just creates a space for, you to be wrong as well as, or right, but, create that dialogue in that. And I think that's right on.
Okay. Candace, thank you. Appreciate that. That's spot on. In fact, I normally don't say this, so I really appreciate Candace bringing this up. This idea of at a minimum, you'll see there that third bullet point says check your perceptions by telling at least 2 stories to every situation where you got to fabricate this thing. I don't know how many people actually do that, but at a minimum, if you say, I could be totally wrong about this, I don't know if that's what happened, I think you're in a position now to have a much more healthy conversation. One thing I want to point out really quickly on the right side of the slide here is this fundamental attribution error. This is a phrase you're going to see a lot throughout the remainder of our time, just because that's really this path to action that the crucial folks have come up with. What they're talking about is the fundamental attribution error, which is this. It's what Candace just said, right? Let's say, and the example many of you know that I always go to is, okay, so Dan's late 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Well, what I attribute it to is called dispositional attribution. I say, well, it's because Dan is lazy. That's the attribution error. Now, it could be that Dan is lazy, but immediately I impute this sort of his disposition or his nature is that he's lazy, not to external circumstances, but to internal ones. Whereas the funny thing, right, for ourselves is we do the opposite. When there's some shortcoming of our own that's kind of gnawing at us that we know, I need to start going to work on time more or whatever. Well, but traffic has been crazy, right? Or the kids have been sick or whatever. And so be aware of that, right? This and everything that we do, this fundamental attribution error. Now, remember, guys, stay with me. Everything we've talked about before and that we're going to talk about still is before the conversation happens. You're still prepping for this conversation. Okay. Now, in that same vein, these are things that people will do during the conversation, but I want you to be aware of them before the conversation. So a lot of these you'll recognize. I love this quote from Holly Weeks. We'll reference her later, taking the stress out of stressful conversations. What we mean by thwarting techniques, or what I call decoys earlier, and the things that you guys reported we wanted to know how to handle. These are psychological, rhetorical mechanisms people use to throw us off balance. In other words, hey, if I know that you're having a conversation with me. I know that I'm in the wrong here. So if I can somehow put up a smoke screen and get it so we can take the focus off me, I'll think that's a victory. And the problem is too often you and I take the bait. In fact, unrelated to this webinar, I was having a conversation with my father-in-law a couple of weeks back, who managed a bank for years and years. He worked at Bank of America. He remembered to this day this one employee he's like, man, I should have just fired him. And of course, you could do that. We can't do that. But he's like, anytime you talk to him about these challenges, he would just do these things to always focus elsewhere, right? He would take it somewhere else, the conversation someplace else. And my father-in-law, recognizing himself, that he'd let him go there, right? He'd let him go there. And so then by the time your time for the conversation is over, you haven't ever gotten really addressed the issue. And he said this guy was masterful at that. And he was still resentful now. He's retired. He's in his mid-70s. And yet he still remembers that guy. So what are some of these thwarting techniques that we see? Shouting, profanity, anger. Of course, we see that. By the way, we won't get into this, but if there's real potential for violence, you need to just get out of there, right? You need to be prepared for that. But emotional outbursts and tears sometimes. And by the way, it's not to say some of these feelings are that they never happen authentically with people. But sometimes they are tactics. They're get the focus off of them tactics. Even the opposite, kind of being glib about it, like, hey, it's not a big deal. And, they're just being funny about it and treating it like it's not a big deal. That can be a thwarting tactic. Being manipulative. Hey, I thought we were friends. Why are you doing this to me? We were friends before you became the boss, that kind of thing. One that I think that is underappreciated is delaying, kind of what my father-in-law talked about, where I know you only have a half hour for this conversation because you're really busy. So you're going to ask me a question, then I'm going to take 20 minutes answering it in the most roundabout way. And then I know there's less time for you to be direct with me. By the way, sometimes this is even worse in our virtual environment today. People can do this and it works. The other, of course, is blaming others. Is simply, it's this person's fault, it's that person's fault. So you got to be prepared for these thwarting techniques, and we'll talk about how to do that in some ways. Bring it back to, you got to recognize them, and in some cases you got to name them. You got to say, it seems to me that this is happening and we don't have time to focus on the real issue here. Can we get back to what I think is the purpose of this conversation, which is boom, right? So again, I'm bringing this up even though this happens mid-conversation. We're still treating this as our prep. So something I've shared with a lot of you, if you take nothing else away from our discussion today, if you can implement this in preparation for your difficult conversations, I would argue it would be worth your time. If you can start implementing this in some degree, maybe even come up with your own, it'll be worth it. It's what I call a difficult conversation pre-mortem. So in other words, you analyze a conversation as opposed to a post-mortem, right? Or an autopsy. How did things go? What was the cause? Why did things go off the rails? It's, let me do this beforehand. Okay. So our pre-mortem here is, first, what do I want from this conversation? Remember our mindset. You have to be able to answer and check your motives for having a conversation in the first place. Is it because sometimes we have conversations to win, right? To demonstrate authority and power over somebody. So ask yourself, really, why are you holding this conversation? Think, care about the work we do, care about the person. Okay, so check your motives there. And then stay with me here on this one. Is it CPR? This is also from the crucial folks. CPR, make sure we understand this, stands for content, pattern, or relationship. What you guys reported quite regularly in the survey we sent out was that you don't want to have the same conversation over and over and over. Well, most often, the first time we have a conversation, it's a content conversation. Your performance is not good enough, your behavior is not appropriate, whatever else it might be. If you've had the conversation and you find yourself having this conversation again, it is now a different conversation. It's now a pattern conversation. We have talked about this before, and yet you continue to right? It is a different conversation. And then finally, and most difficultly, if it's difficultly a word, anyway, it becomes a relationship conversation. I'm not sure I can trust you anymore because we've talked about this X amount of times and this is still happening. Relationship conversations are the most difficult to happen. So you kind of see the progression here. First time conversations are content. After that, once you've done it, it's a different conversation. You should not be having the same conversation over and over. And then, of course, always think long-term in terms of what you want out of this conversation. You want them to do their job well, and you want them to have still a good trust-based, healthy, professional relationship with them. Okay? Now, again, I'm flying through this, but again, it's being recorded. We can go back and review this, so you can reach out. We can talk about it more. Number 2 is, what is my history with this person? What's our level of trust? Gina mentioned this, right? She talked about, look, she knows some people's communication style is, I can just set up the appointment and they're going to be like, oh, good, I have time to prepare. Other people are going to fret about it and you're doing them a massive disservice. Look, some people, look, I feel like on my team in particular, we can be pretty direct with each other. There's trust there. We can just kind of say, hey, make sure you're watching this, make sure you're paying attention to this. I can say, Dan, you're being kind of this way, whatever. To the degree that there's that trust, the more confidence we'll have in being direct and assertive in our conversations. And then finally, what are their communication triggers? Kind of like what Gina talked about. And what are our communication triggers? Do I know that the second someone gets aggressive, I retreat? Well, then what can I do about that? What can I do? How can I mentally prepare? What can I come up with? And you'll see this in the third one, so that that doesn't happen. Because I know that I do that, right? Someone gets aggressive and I back down, they win. They're like, good. I know Dan doesn't like having these conversations, so I can get aggressive with him and he'll relent and then I'm off the hook. No, we got to prepare for that. And finally, what's the law of this situation? So what's going on in context? Okay. What facts do I have? Remember what Candace talked about with facts versus stories. What are the actual facts that I have and what are just stories that I'm telling myself? Now, a lot of you talked about not sure HR will have your back or if upper management will have your back. So you need to know very pragmatically, what degree of organizational support do I have in having this conversation? You may want to go ask that directly. Okay. And then finally, one thing that I've added here, we'll talk about, what are my scripts? Holly Weeks, who I referenced earlier, call these hip pocket phrases. Are there things? So to Gina's point, I think it's good to go in with some scripts, knowing there are certain things that I want to say. If I had to give an elevator pitch for what this conversation is about and what I think the problem is, how can I say that in an articulate way, including writing this down, or even, you guys, practicing with people in having this dialogue. Yeah, that's labor intensive, but it'll certainly help you as you prepare for these conversations. And then what are some hip pocket phrases that I can go to so that when I see this conversation kind of going off the rails, that I can go back to and say, hey, remember, here's what I want the conversation to be about. Or remember, I see you getting angry. Here is all that I am trying to say, right? Have scripts in place there. It sounds fun to us, and we don't want to be overly scripted, but it's very useful. Okay. So you're in this conversation. A lot of us, you talked about, well, what do I do when they do one of these thwarting techniques or the wheels start to come off? Well, go back to your scripts or those hip pocket phrases. Okay. Next thing you do is take some ownership for this. Say, hey, you know what? Maybe I'm not communicating very well here. Or, you know what? Maybe and by the way, maybe you are getting too aggressive, too emotional, too passive aggressive, whatever it is. Anything that it is, don't take total responsibility when it goes off the rails or they start giving you thwarting techniques, but take some ownership and say, you know what? Maybe I'm not being very clear. Or, you know what? Maybe I stated that too strongly. What I meant to say was, and then restate your intentions. And say, here is really the heart of what I want to talk about. Now, you know what the heart of what you want to talk about because you did it in your pre-mortem, right? And then if you need to, there's this technique called contrasting, saying, look, I'm not saying you're a bad employee. All I'm saying is there's been a noticeable dip in your performance in the past week or the past month, right? Or it seems to me that there's been some anger issues in the past month. And, you can try saying, I'm not saying that you're bad. I'm not saying, and then say what you are saying. Again, name the tactics being used. In other words, you got to be very careful with this. You don't want to go and be like, you're using thwarting technique number 3 and no, just saying, it seems to me that you're getting anger. And the problem is when you get angry, I tend, and I'm just using this as a specific example here. I tend to back down, and the problem is we can't have a good dialogue here. So, and so that a lot of that's on me. I don't want you to get angry. Maybe I'm communicating poorly. So there, you're taking some responsibility, and be honest about those apprehensions. You and I, if we are uncomfortable having conversations, let's say we're having conversations with someone. We don't want to hurt their feelings. We're talk about it and say, I'm really reluctant to do these, more reluctant than I should be, because I'm always scared that I'm going to hurt your feelings or I'm going to say something bad, and I don't want to. So just open up about those, and then look for mutual purpose. Always say, okay, what is it that we both want? What is it, this mutual purpose that we have? By the way, that should be performing well, right? The success of the team, the success of the individual, that's your mutual purpose. Go back to that and say, look, I think we both want you to be successful here. I think we both think you're talented. I think we both care about what happens on this team. And so that's why I wanted to have this conversation. Look for that shared or mutual purpose. Okay. Now I'm going through this quickly. But I think a lot of this will be intuitive, or some of you are already doing these things. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but again, the DNA of conversation management, kind of just to summarize here, is clarity, know your purpose, why you're having it in the first place. One thing we spend a lot of time talking about in the live training that we're not going to talk about here is being aware of your nonverbal communication, your tone. Now, of course, tone matters maybe more than body language in our virtual world right now. The other thing I'll say, and I'm not going to read this whole Benjamin Franklin quote, but this idea of diplomatic dialogue. Or other people say talk tentatively. In other words, just make sure you're communicating in a way that says, I know my stories are stories, and I know my facts are facts. So if I'm not going to confuse stories and facts, as Candace talked about, then when it's a story, as she mentioned, it seemed to me, Susie, that you're mad at me. That's not saying, Susie, why are you mad at me? That's not diplomatic. Diplomatic communication recognizes that I have an opinion, but I know that it could be wrong, and you have an opinion, and I'm interested in hearing that viewpoint. That's when we communicate diplomatically. If you want to know the opposite of diplomatic dialogue, read the comments section of social media or online newspaper articles or whatever. Okay, online political comments. That's the opposite of diplomatic dialogue. It's, here's my opinion, I'm going to state it as fact, and anyone who disagrees is an idiot. We want to communicate differently than that. We want to say, hey, tell me here's how I see it. Now, when you have facts, that's okay to state as a fact. You've been late 4 times in the past 2 weeks. That's a fact. But once you go to opinion or story, you need to communicate it as such. Okay? So what are the ways in which we unwittingly contribute to toxic dialogue? We're on this third bullet point now. We've talked about trust. We've talked about, again, taking the stress out of the conversations is doing all this pre-work that we talked about, okay? So what are some of the ways that we contribute? Well, it's supportive communication versus toxicity that I've called it here, right? We want to communicate in a supportive fashion versus being toxic. And you'll see these dichotomies here. We'll talk about each of these, but look at what Denhart and others say here. They're primarily public organizational experts, but it says, look, if you can communicate supportively, they've found that organizations that do this are more productive, they're better at problem solving, they have higher quality outcomes, and have fewer conflicts than organizations that don't. So this is what we want to do. Okay, make sure we're communicating supportively and getting out the toxicity. The first is being problem-oriented, not people-oriented. Look at that phrase there again, fundamental attribution error. People that are problem-oriented talk about why behaviors are problematic and not why the person is bad. Now that seems kind of adolescent, but in other words, it's someone who focuses. Normally, when we say someone's people-oriented, that's good. But when we're talking about problem behaviors or actions, being people-oriented is attributing to them motives that might not be there. In other words, talking about they're being late to work 4 times in the past 2 weeks, right? And why that behavior could be problematic. We say your laziness is really affecting your relationship with the rest of the team. In other words, Dan, you're lazy. You are bad. You are not good enough. You are insufficient. That's what people that are people-oriented here. We can't communicate that way. So focus on their behaviors, not who they are, not their fundamental worth. Okay, when we do that, it automatically makes people defensive. It automatically either leads them to silence or violence, right? They go, okay, I'm shutting down. I'm not participating in this. Well, you think I'm terrible, so I'm whatever. Or they go, what? You're calling me, and we get those negative reactions. Okay, so focus on the problem. When we focus on the people in this sense, it becomes toxic. Secondly, I love this one. Conjunctive versus disjunctive. Conjunctives, communicators, make everything relevant to the intention and the purpose of the conversation. So let me give you a weird example about this. I still remember this to this day. I had two buddies I was watching the Super Bowl with, and one of them, I remember, was kind of, for lack of a better term, wasn't as experienced with football as the other. And there was a pass interference call in the Super Bowl. And they disagreed on whether it was a good call or not. I know this is so trivial, it's dumb, but stay with me. And one of the person that was less experienced with football was saying, no, I think it was a good call. And they're going back and forth about why it was a good call or not, until the person who was more experienced with football said, look, Matt, I don't think you've watched enough football to really know. And I was really impressed with Matt's response. He said, that doesn't mean I'm wrong here, though. He called out that was a disjunctive comment. That was, it's called an it's a logical fallacy. It's called an ad hominem attack. In other words, I'm not winning the argument based on whether this is a good pass interference call or not, whether the ref was right or wrong. And so I'm going to undermine you by saying, I don't think you've watched enough football to really know. That had nothing to do with whether he was right or wrong in this context, in this specific moment. And my friend here really kind of called out very calmly. I was like, man, that's actually really impressive because he's spot on. Well, we do this all the time, right? Look at this bottom quote. Like, we're getting frustrated with a person and they're saying, yeah, but what about this and this? And we say, well, look, I don't expect you to really know because you've never been a manager. That is disjunctive, right? And by the way, we see this in familial or interpersonal relationships all the time, where someone gets mad, or by the way, you see it in politics all the time, where you're having an argument. It should be related, should be conjunctive, should be related to the content. Now, if you do need to talk about someone's lack of management experience, or someone, in my case, lack of football experience, both parties should agree to move on to a different conversation. Okay, because that is a separate conversation. So always try and make sure that what you're talking about is actually relevant. They're not personal digs in there to undermine somebody, right? And this allows for you to actually focus and resolve the problem at hand. Okay. Similar, not unrelated to this, is validating versus demeaning. Just avoid demeaning phrases. So let me go back to the bottom quote that you see there. Someone who's validating would be like, hey, I think I understand where you're coming from. I see it differently, but I think I see where you're coming from, versus you're not making any sense. Okay. Sometimes most of us are not, for lack of a better term, mean enough to just go straight toxic and say, well, that's a stupid idea. But sometimes we do, or we do it in ways that we don't mean to. Okay. So avoid demeaning phrases. Be willing to be flexible and respect other people's opinions. By the way, it's kind of like Candace talked about, be open to this idea that you could be wrong. And you want to do this because you're going to have future challenging conversations with people. And so you want this to be a good experience. And by the way, really quickly, a lot of times, whether we are being demeaning, validating, or demeaning, will come down to our nonverbal communication. As I'm looking, as my facial expressions are, or my tone, right, in our virtual environment, are dismissive of what the person is saying, even if my word choice is fine, we know that the way we communicate things can be demeaning and mean based on our tone. Okay. I love this one. Okay. Owned versus disowned. You need to, if you want to avoid toxic action, a lot of times people who are trying to not be too aggressive or are trying to get the responsibility of themselves, they will say, yeah, well, you know what? They decided to give the promotion to someone else instead of, I have decided to give the promotion to someone else. Or there are a lot of people that think your behavior has been really weird lately, versus I'm concerned about your behavior lately. When we have disowned conversations, let me tell you, it does a couple things. First of all, I know I can't have a direct, good, healthy dialogue with you anymore, because now you've put the responsibility out there on these anonymous others. Okay. And you and I can't talk about our issues. The other thing, quite frankly, is it reduces your power. I don't mean that in an authoritarian kind of sense, but it takes away your power, because you're like, oh, other people are making these choices. Own your feelings in this conversation of why you're having this conversation, and say, I'm feeling this way. I have seen things. I have this opinion. It is so ineffective. And by the way, I've had to have this conversation. I'm talking with like executive level folks who said, oh, why don't we go out and say, we've all talked. And I'm saying, no, you executive director need to say, this is your opinion on it, because you are diminishing your power. And it seems like an attempt to shield ourselves from responsibility. Okay. So owned versus disowned. And then finally, two-way versus one-way. What we're really talking about here is two-way is supportive communication. We're talking about active listening and how fundamentally critical this is. Toxic communication. Now, by the way, I want to say quickly here that I'm not saying there isn't ever a time where you should do the majority of the talking, but on the whole, you and I suffer from a lack of listening. And I've got here a couple phrases. I think most of us know what's involved with real active listening. The first thing I'm going to say is the best thing that you can do to become a more effective active listener is try. And actually say, I need to listen to this person. Go back to Candace's point and say, maybe I'm wrong. I need to see things from their perspective. In fact, I put this here. I don't know why. I've never talked about this before, but I like the public defender standard. What if you went into a situation and said, I want to listen to them so well that if I had to defend their position, I could do it. That I could say, okay, they're feeling angry because this, and this. That's a really good standard. Now, Brent, I don't know if you're on yet, Brent, but if you're out there, will you talk about what you think the role of listening is in effective communication? Are you there, Brent?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead.
Effective listening? I mean, really, it comes down to when I go into a difficult conversation, I try to do a lot of listening at the beginning because I think listening builds a lot of trust. And if you're doing all the talking and you're not letting them express what their opinion is, I think it negates some of that trust. So I would say that's the big thing for me is whenever I'm about to have a really tough conversation, I try to spend a lot of time listening and trying to, lead the conversation a little bit if I can, right? Depending on the level of emotion accompanying it. But I think if you're not listening, people don't, it's so trite, but people really don't know how much you care, how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think that goes for everything like this in managerial settings.
By the way, I love that. And you'll notice I don't have that written here. And so I love that idea of if you want to build trust, listen, think about that. If intentions, right, or motivations are a key part of me trusting you, and I find that you genuinely listen to me, I love that thought, Brent, that, yeah, there's going to be trust built. Okay. Now, again, the other thing, thank you, Brent. I appreciate that. The other thing that I would say is we have to work harder at demonstrating our listening in virtual environments. Okay. I think we're all hoping that these virtual environments are not universal or exclusive, right? That we get some normalcy back as time goes on. But no matter what, it might be if they can't read my nonverbals, which is a huge part of demonstrating my listening, I've got to do it in other ways, including maybe more clarification, more questions that demonstrate that I've been listening. But anyway, I love that. Listen to build trust. Okay. And go in there with the idea, could I defend their position? Because I could be wrong, right? Let me go in there and really listen. Okay. By the way, here's some just other things. A lot of these are the same. So here's some other things to avoid. Again, you've got to recognize the impact of your communication, not just your intentions. Sometimes, again, they won't know your intentions. They'll only know the impact of how you're communicating. But I would say avoid phrases like always and never because they're inflammatory. Don't beat around the bush. Just get to it. Have enough confidence, have done enough in your premortem to know why you're having this conversation, have enough confidence in what your facts versus your stories or opinions are, and then go in and just say it. Don't hint at it passive aggressively. Don't do it kind of jokily, again, I'm not sure jokily is a word either. Lots of invented words today, but really just get at it. So, and we do these other things, right, that demonstrate that we're afraid to have the conversation. Hey, why do you think I've called you in here today? Right? Or, hey, how do you think you're doing? Well, get to it. Okay. You just say it. Own it. It's kind of like that own versus disown conversation. Okay. The last thing we need to discuss here today is how to manage up or improve your conversation with your boss. Now, I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert. The first answer that's going to be terribly unsatisfying to you is everything that we've talked about today. Okay. Everything that we've talked about applies to improving communication with your boss as well. Premortems, all that kind of stuff, right? So a lot of this is taken from the kind of the initial article on this from Cotter and Gabaro, Managing Your Boss. They're not talking about brown nosing. What they're talking about is creating a mutually beneficial relationship with our superiors. Okay? And I know that a lot of us struggle to communicate with our bosses, and that's why we've added it to this very quick overview webinar. Okay, so again, some things you've got to know. There is mutual dependence. It is not, the power dynamic is not unilateral. You have to remember that your bosses and managers, you know this from your employees as well, they depend on you. Employees decide whether or not you're an effective manager or not. They decide whether you're a leader or not you. So there is mutual dependence there. And like I said earlier, everything that we've talked about applies here. Okay. You do need to pick your battle. I hate to sound so political here, but you do need to, if you're going to have difficult conversations with your boss, you probably got to pick your battles a little more carefully, because you could be right. It's a phrase a colleague of mine uses. I love it. You could be right, totally in the right with what your boss is doing. They're doing something wrong, but you could be dead right. It's great that you're right, but you handled it in a way, or you picked at something too often, or that you shouldn't have. So just be aware of that. Okay. And again, the impact of not, quote, managing your boss, that should be in quotes there, is usually felt more by the employee. So in other words, you and I should be incentivized to manage our bosses, and have effective communications with our bosses. Now, I'm going to give you a couple things here to consider. Now, you've got a picture there of Tim Brown. I'm going to lose some credibility here. I'm a Raiders fan. Which immediately with football fans loses me credibility. But I just happened to catch this thing where Tim Brown, Hall of Fame wide receiver for the Raiders, his first practice with the Raiders, he'd won the Heisman Trophy. He was drafted by the Raiders. His coach on that first week of practice was chewing him, swearing every swear word in the book. And by the way, his coach was a Hall of Fame receiver. And finally, Tim Brown just said that wasn't Tim Brown's communication style. So he just went to his coach, Fred Biletnikoff, and he said this in his Hall of Fame speech. He said, "We got to work something else out. I don't respond well to that." And he said, and of course, he had a 15-year career with the Raiders and with this coach. And he said that conversation was that initial point to that good working relationship. So I love that as an example of getting this good relationship with your boss. So you need to know your boss has professional and personal objectives. Learn what they are. Learn what their work style preferences are, and know that they have a communication style. Well, you also have professional, personal objectives. You have work style preferences, and you have a communication style. You don't have to have the exact same. My current boss has a different work style preference than I do. Now, thankfully, he knows me well enough to know that I have to meander. Like if we're trying to solve a problem, I have to explore every nook and cranny and kind of talk about tangents and other things. Whereas he's like, okay, well, let's just stay focused on this one thing. Well, we have a good enough relationship when we know each other well enough that he allows me that, because he knows that I have to do that to come back to the point, right? That's my work style. That's when we're solving problems. That's how I like to tackle it. And thankfully, he allows me that. So you don't have to have the same, but it's good to be aware and talk about these things and say, these are my work style preferences. I know this is how I communicate. It seems to me you communicate this way. Tell me what your expectations are of me. You know, a lot of these things that we can do if we're just willing to talk to our boss about it. Okay. This is interesting. I want you to pay attention to the thing on the left here, the axis on the left and the axis at the bottom. You also want to know your tendency towards authority. All this is if you are counter-dependent, and I think I fall in this realm actually, people that are highly counter-dependent, a new phrase, psychological phrase, is they resist authority. They fight with the boss because they're a boss. They fight with the boss because it's their manager, and they hate authority. And I'm not talking about like people that are in jail. I'm talking about professionals, right? Who just by default, they're like, no, I resent the fact that this person has authority over me. And they fight kind of unnecessarily. On the other extreme is over-dependent, right? You see kind of there in that loyal category. These are the people that kind of think their bosses have all the answers. They never disagree with their boss, even when they should, even when it would be welcome. And they kind of see their boss as an all-wise parent who will solve all their problems and will take care of their career because I was so good to this boss. You kind of want to know where you fit on this spectrum. Just so you can manage that appropriately. Do you tend to be the over-dependent type that's too deferential to the boss? Remember, there's a mutual dependence there. Or are you counter-dependent, where you happen to be like, man, sometimes I argue with the boss or I resent their authority just because they're my boss. Okay. Knowing that about yourself is going to help you improve, because then you can do something about it. It's going to help you improve your relationship with your boss. So finally is this, okay? And you know, I kind of want to create one of these that people can, you know, so they can actually create a checklist, but you can do this virtually as well, right? We're recording this session, you can look at it. But this is a checklist for managing your boss. You understand your boss's context, right? They're goals and objectives, their preferred work style. Understand yourself, those same things. And then finally, foster a relationship with your boss that fits both of you, has mutual and clear expectations. Say, I never seem to know exactly what you want of me. Can we talk about that so I know exactly to give you what you need, what will help you be successful? This is you talking to your boss, right? It keeps your boss informed, but it is also sensitive to the fact that your boss is, like you, is probably very, very busy. Success in organizations, you guys, effective communication in organizations relies on trust and good relationships. And that includes your relationship with your boss. And there are a lot of people that say, what? It's not my job to manage my relationship with my boss. That's their job. You do that at your own peril. Consciously and proactively manage your relationship with your boss as well. Now, I cannot overstate, you guys, how critical the things are that we've talked about today. So what I've given you here are some resources. I like to do this at the end of our sessions. This is not an all-encompassing list, obviously, but difficult conversations. If you Google any one of these, you'll get a, something will come up. I love the difficult conversation. It's kind of the original. Crucial accountability. I like that better than crucial conversations because it includes crucial conversations within the book, kind of. So you can just read Crucial Accountability and get both books, 2 for 1, kind of. Radical Candor. I think I'm seeing in lots of, or I was seeing, I should say, in airports, things like that. And again, cheat sheet, you guys. HBR top 10 must reads. These are all articles, 10 articles on the subject of communication. And usually these articles have books out. So people go and read those books. You could just read the article. And then finally, an article called Managing Your Boss from a long time back that all subsequent managing your boss, communicating with your boss things kind of stem from. Okay. Before we leave, you guys, 2 weeks from today, 10 a.m., couldn't be more excited about the next webinar. It's on coaching. Coaches want no experience required. It's going to be presented by Mark Osenbach, training director at JJS. Fantastic guy, expert on this stuff, great personality. I was going to say biggest Phillies fan or Eagles and Sixers fan in the state, maybe. And when I say biggest, I mean he's a big dude too, actually. You're going to love hearing from Mark Osenbach on this critical topic of how we create coaching cultures in our agencies, okay? And then finally, again, we're going to send out the video to this. We're going to send out an evaluation if it hasn't been sent out already. But look, we've got over a 30,000 foot view of difficult conversations, how we get more prepared for them. Revisit this stuff if you need to, right? Go back and cover the points, maybe especially that pre-mortem. I'm very confident can be helpful to you. But thank you for your time, guys. Again, I'm not sure there's a more important topic that we can talk about. As important as all of these are, this one certainly resonates with me. But we want to be more confident in having these conversations. You can do it. Okay, I promise you, you and I can get better at this. I have worked directly, coached with, trained with people that have gotten better at this and have improved their confidence and are more willing to have these conversations. And it's changed their management. It's changed their leadership. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing now. I'll go check out questions and things like that. But thank you for your time. Again, sorry I went over a little bit. But appreciate it, guys. Thanks. See you in 2 weeks.